Thank you all for attending this session on what I think is kind of the critical issue in Washington coming up over the next couple of months, the prospects for corporate tax reform and broader individual tax reform. And I'll just quickly introduce the panelists. I'm Ben White from Politico. I write the Morning Money column and cover the nexus of finance and politics. We've got Chris Campbell, who is the staff director at the Senate Finance Committee. Russ DeVol is chief research officer at Milken. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. Gene Sperling, whom you all know as president of Sperling Economic Strategies, former national economic advisor to Presidents Obama and Clinton. Mark Weinberger, the global chairman and CEO of Ernst & Young. I want to start with Chris as our resident congressional source here to give us the latest on progress towards an actual piece of legislation that can get through the House and the Senate and be signed by President Trump on corporate tax reform. And we're going to sort of go back and forth between calling this tax cuts and tax reform, and we can debate which it's going to wind up being. They're obviously two very different things, whether you're actually going to do reform or you're just going to do supply-side cuts. But I want to ask you, Chris, first of all, you said something interesting to me as we were getting ready to come in here. There's kind of a conventional wisdom out there in the world that at the end of the day, this is going to wind up being a business tax cut. It's going to be too hard to do individual taxes at the same time. You have a very different view on that the president will have to do all of them together politically, both cut the corporate rate and cut individual tax rates. So I want to get your take on that, and then tell us exactly where we are in terms of being on the same page between Ryan, your office, the president, and the White House. What are the nature of discussions right now? When can we expect an actual piece of legislation to be introduced and hit the floor?
Well, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the introduction. So we are at a very interesting and very unique point in Washington, D.C. right now, where we have an unconventional president. We have a Congress made up of Republicans and notionally of the same party.
Notionally.
And we have, but ideologically geared toward, what can be reform-natured agenda. First of all, your first point, comprehensive versus corporate. It's very difficult to imagine that this president being elected by the constituency that elected him, a lot of crossover Democrats, union members, union households, people that don't earn a lot of money, but see a lot of promise and a lot of an opportunity through President Trump to shake up things in Washington. It's very difficult to see him deliver on that promise by doing corporate-only tax reform. So it's very tough politically, I think, to be able to go back to the American people and suggest that we're going to cut the corporate tax on Walmart or any other name of a company, and not do so for middle Americans and middle class Americans. And so that's, I think, the reality of what and I think members feel the same way, congressmen and senators. So I believe that whatever we do is going to be comprehensive. And the way we get there is this. We have, I don't want to veer off into healthcare too much, but I will say this, that we on Capitol Hill, as well as the White House, I think have learned from the mistakes of what we encountered on healthcare and trying to pass healthcare reform several months ago. Actually several weeks ago.
And today, for that matter.
Even as early as today. There was, let's just say there were a lot of people who felt that they were in charge of passing healthcare reform. And which led to a diversity of ideas and diversity of people who believed that they were negotiating on behalf of the President and the Congress on healthcare reform. That is not going to be the case on tax reform. The President has very smartly called the leaders of the House and Senate together, myself, my committee, the Ways and Means Committee, the Senate Majority Leader, and the House Speaker, as well as Stephen Mnuchin and Gary Cohen, Secretary Mnuchin, to come up with a unified plan on tax reform. That way, when we're finished with that package, we will have one Republican unified position on tax reform. That will be the position of the party, and the majorities in both houses of Congress, as well as the President, will put their weight behind that one package. Very different approach to what we did on healthcare reform, and that will significantly help and aid in the ability to be able to pass something when it comes time to do so.
Okay, I don't want to bring in all the rest of the panel. I don't want to pepper Chris with too much off the top of the bat, but I've obviously got a lot of questions for how this process will actually play out. I want to ask him quickly about the nature of getting this bill through. If you do it through reconciliation, you run into the Byrd rule, you run into the problem that any reduction in rates cannot add to the deficit over 10 years. There's been multiple studies. It's hard to score what came out of the White House because there were so few details on who the individual rates would apply to. But if you just went from 35 to 15 in the corporate rate, you're going to impact the deficit in a relatively short period of time. An argument made that they would have to sunset after 2 or 3 years. If, as Secretary Mnuchin suggested this morning in his remarks, and seems to be the direction of this, that tax reform will be a party line vote, how do you do it through reconciliation without running afoul of the Byrd rule and having to sunset it after 2 to 3 years?
So without putting everyone to sleep about talking about the minutiae of the Byrd rule, there are several, in order for Congress to pass a bill with that not, typically it takes 60 votes in the U.S. Senate to pass anything. You can have 1 or 2 bills a year that bring that vote total down to 51 or 50, a simple majority. That's called reconciliation, and but you're very constrained what you can write in that bill. It has to have a budgetary impact, so it must raise or lower taxes or increase or decrease spending. And literally every word and every comma in the bill must be somehow impact the budget. Actually, Doug Holtz-Eakin is a former Congressional Budget Office director. He can also speak on this as well. And Gene issued a lot of bills through the Congress. So you're dramatically constrained what you can write in that package. It also usually leads to a partisan vote, so a Republican-only vote in the current makeup of the Congress. Conversely, the Democrats, this is how they passed half of Obamacare. But in the constraint of how you can write the bill, there is a 1, 5, and 10-year test on deficit neutrality, which could force you to sunset any tax cuts in any of those markers. Our goal as a party, because we aim to do something rather large, specifically moving from a worldwide system to a territorial system, where capital planning it's a long-term a game, so it's 10 to 20 years for the C-suites of most companies to be able to make those capital planning investments overseas. Our intent is to make it permanent, and the only way you can do that is to meet those tests and have it revenue neutral. So you've heard that what the Secretary has said is that he believes that growth will be a significant component to paying for the tax reform package. And I'm certainly hopeful that that's in fact the case, but we're also constrained with what the Joint Committee on Taxation, our independent scorekeeper, how they score the bill and how much growth they give us. And so the growth that JCT gives us, as well as the various components of the tax code that we'll have to remove to be able to pay down those rates and do it revenue neutral. Our aim is to make sure that we actually meet that target, and to make sure that we maintain the Byrd test, the Byrd rule.
I'm going to come back to you, Ross, in just a second, but I want to go to Doug and ask you, can they do what he says that they can do in terms of growth being enough to pay for this, and to do it on a party line vote in a way that would not add to deficits over 10 years?
I'm on record as disagreeing with the Secretary. Growth alone cannot pay for it.
Right.
That's just not consistent with any of the facts that we know, and so I'm happy that he says things like that. I think there's a second downside to that. Actually, this may be even more important, which is tax reform consists of lower rates, good news for everybody, broaden the base, tough calls. Help some people, hurt others. That's why tax reform is hard. It's all about making those tough calls. Over in the House of Representatives, they have been at that process for a number of months now. They've been making the tough calls on the base, and you've heard lots of things about them. Interest deductions, border adjustments, all that stuff. And they've been, sort of having people throw rocks at them every day. When the White House says, oh, well, you can just cut the rates and growth will pay for it, it makes it sound like, why is the House doing that?
Right.
And it undercuts, in my view, the validity of those efforts. That's what tax reform really is.
Right.
And it's not helpful for them to characterize it differently.
Yeah, okay. Ross, if you wanted to tell us a little bit about why we need corporate tax reform and exactly what you think it should entail and what do you think it ultimately will entail. And then I'll ask our other two panelists the same thing. What should it look like and what will it look like?
All right, well, thank you, Ben. Let's go to slide 8. You can't have a Milken Institute panel without at least a couple of slides. So slide 8. That's still not slide 8. Well, let's explain it. There's slide 8. Okay. So the United States, its business tax system is no longer competitive. A number of dimensions. One of them is the rate itself. We now have the highest marginal tax rate in the world among advanced countries at just below 40%, including state and local tax. Japan used to have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, but Japan had enough foresight a couple years ago, after Abe took over, to start reducing their corporate tax rates. And why does this matter for growth? Well, what we found is that companies are largely making investment decisions on where to allocate capital across the globe, relying much too importantly on the tax rates. Tax rates have become a major consideration as to where you locate capital, both intellectual capital and physical capital. And we have put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage. And I could go through a litany of econometric studies showing the differences when you reduce marginal tax rates on corporations across countries. Even Europe, France cut their corporate tax rate below ours. Germany took it from 52% a few years ago down to what, like 27 or 28. So other countries have been doing this. And why does it matter? Well, we have been getting less inward foreign direct investment from abroad. Companies, when you combine it with a territorial tax system that we don't have, we tax earnings worldwide, we really put ourselves in a competitive disadvantage. So when Boeing produces a plane in China and sells it in China, they pay the Chinese tax rate, which is much less. And then if they want to bring those earnings home, they're taxed on the difference. So guess what the pharmaceutical companies and Boeing decide to do, and Apple? Well, they leave their earnings abroad. They don't bring them back home. So we set up a system where you could permanently domicile your earnings abroad, declare them that they're abroad, and not tax them. And so guess what? Corporations respond to incentives. They're leaving these assets abroad. There's somewhere between 2.5 to 3 trillion that's outside the country that doesn't look like it's coming back anytime soon. And it matters for growth. I'm going to spare you a few more charts, but at least we put up one. Back to Doug's point, I think we've got to be honest, though, when we talk about what are the growth stimulating properties of reducing corporate tax rates, what I would call modernizing the corporate tax system. We're not going to magically jump to 4% growth. Right? That's not realistic. I tend to be considered an optimist on this question, and I get up to 0.2, maybe 0.3 a couple of years. So after a decade, we're talking at about 2% higher GDP. I think you can make the case with business tax reform, deregulation in financial markets across the board, reducing regulations, and infrastructure investment, you can maybe take the potential growth in GDP from 2.1%, say to 2.7, 2.8, maybe 2.9. So Stephen Mnuchin inherited a difficult task to walk back the 4% number. And so he chose to start with 3%, maybe not entirely transparent, but a bit more honest. But to say that corporate tax reductions would pay for themselves is a misnomer. Yeah. It's just not realistic.
Yeah. Gene, talk to me about it doesn't look like we're going to get any kind of bipartisan tax reform package. I mean, we could talk all about 1986 and how millions of miles away we are from a process like that took years and was truly bipartisan and wound up in a really enormous tax reform package. But if there were to actually be some agreement to be made between Democrats and Republicans on a tax reform package, just assuming that you generally agree that the overall corporate rate is too high and should be somewhat lower than it is now, what would it look like? And is there any hope for that? Or should we just assume that this is going to be Republicans with 51 votes in the Senate passing some kind of tax cuts for business and presumably individuals?
Sure.
So here's what I think a bipartisan plan would look like. I agree, President Obama agreed, that we needed to, that's not enough for my booming voice, agreed that corporate tax reform was a positive thing, done right. And I would say that there were 3 pillars to that. And I think there was a while when we were in a period of divided government where it looked like there could be a conversation on those 3 pillars. And I think you saw some actual real live discussions going on with Democrats and Republicans. And I think so, number 1, you were going to lower rates by broadening the base. You were going to argue for revenue neutrality. And some on our side wanted to affirmatively raise rates, but there was actually a consistent number of people who wanted revenue neutrality. And the argument is that our kind of broken corporate tax system, some people pay way too much and some people pay nothing, and that our effective rate was actually kind of right in the middle of the OECD or the G7. So the problem was to reform the tax code. So one pillar was lower corporate tax rates in a revenue neutral. Now, if that seems like I'm being quite progressive, I think that is what the Business Roundtable is for. That's what the former Republican House Ways and Means Committee, I think that's what a lot of Republicans are for. So that was one pillar. I think a second pillar was that there was an attempt at a kind of compromise that actually had some political compromise but some economic logic to it, which was to have a kind of minimum tax You can argue about the number. President Obama proposed 19%. But above that minimum tax, you could move your money freely back and forth. So the kind of the political compromise was progressives kind of won worldwide income up to a point, and people who felt like they wanted to return their money could essentially do it if they weren't really in a super low tax haven. So there really was a kind of that was kind of the political compromise. The economic logic was that when you just go to territorial, you actually can accelerate the race to the bottom. Now everybody can just keep going lower and lower with their rates. When you have a minimum tax, suddenly Ireland doesn't have an incentive to compete with someone else on continually lowering the rate, because any American company is going to pay a certain amount. If they pay 10% that year in Ireland, they're going to pay 9% in the US if it was 19%. So that made a bit of logic, and I actually think a lot of our European partners would have liked the fact that it would stop the race to the bottom, and yet it would allow people to move money back and forth, and you wouldn't have this incentive to stash. The third pillar was that there would be a one-time deemed tax on money that was never taxed. Because it's one time, I think Doug and I might even agree on this, you don't use one-time money for permanent things. So if you have like a one-time money coming in, you really should either go to deficit reduction or to pay for another one-time thing. So how nice, make that one-time thing an infrastructure package. Therefore, it's one time. A large number of people, we now see even President Trump supposedly, we'll see, support infrastructure. And that also gave Democrats what was for many their number one jobs incentive. That really was a logic that you could have worked on. And then the issue that Chris says is, well, it's very hard to just do corporate taxes. So I think if you were going to have that fourth leg, you would have had an individual tax cut that largely centered almost exclusively on middle class and working poor Americans. Supposedly, we all agree that those are the Americans that have not been doing well the last 15, 20 years. So you would not have a tax cut that went significantly to the top 1%. And you would not have a pass-through rate that just went to anybody who was a pass-through. Not just your mom and pop small business that we're all sympathetic to, but to every corporate law partner, to partnerships at lobbying, hedge funds, oh my God, even consulting, little enterprises like mine. This was not going to happen. So I think that that's what a deal would have looked like. So if you take each of those four things quickly, instead of it being revenue neutral, this is going to be $2-3 trillion tax cut, largely unpaid for, at least. no sense of the reform or tough decisions, even the ones being talked about in the House. If you look at the second part, we don't know yet. But just saying there's a territorial system does not do anything about base erosion or race to the bottom. No way Democrats can ever support it. 3, there's not even going to be infrastructure in this bill, and they may use that one-time money to try to lower permanent rates. And 4, I never understand this. I do not understand why the Republican Party continually loads its tax cuts to people in the very top 1%. Now that I've left government, I guess I'm in that world. I think there's a lot of challenges in life. I don't think lowering most of the people's individual tax in this room should be one of them. So, and to have the 15% rate compared to a 35% rate, you think LeBron James is going to be working on a salary next year? I'll tell you the one thing Stephen Curry and LeBron James will figure out is how to be partners in the Golden State Warriors. Right. So this is not even an effort at bipartisanship. It's not even try. And I'll coin one phrase, which is to say that, in China currency, we talk about they face a trilemma. There's 3 things you can't do at the same time. Here's 3 things. Here's the tax reform trilemma. You cannot lower rates so significantly, number 1, and number 2, decide you're not going to do really tough reforms like getting rid of interest deductibility or border adjustment tax or whatever the measure is. And number 3, have a deficit neutral plan that's not going to be subject to the Byrd rule. And what's very clear is that the Trump administration has decided, at least initially, that they can't meet that trilemma, so they're going to give up any sense of responsibility and really propose what would be one of the most dramatic debt increases ever. And even if you believe that growth will get better, it won't get that much better, and it won't help the fact that the first few years of their administration, even if you believe growth assumptions, will be them when they do their debt limits asking for a far higher debt limit because of their specific proposals with an all-Republican government.
Right. There's a lot in there that I want to get to hear from Chris on and Doug
That's
on too, but I want to bring in Mark first to talk us through a little bit what you see as the ideal corporate tax reform package that could come out of Capitol Hill and the White House that would bring faster growth, that would help big companies, that would make us more competitive. Just give us your perfect scenario.
So I will, and I'm going to try and keep the politics out of this. I think we're getting a lot of, and you can't help but get into politics and a lot of this stuff, but realistically, the only plan that's going to help is one that's going to pass the Congress. So you can't have a theoretical plan and say that it's going to be something that's going to be driving it. Like the House Blueprint is a great plan. It's theoretically one of the best plans I've seen the Congress put out ever. The chances of it passing the Congress exactly like it was written is slim, and that's why I think you're seeing you have 0 up. It's slim. So where are we really, if you think of it this way? The reason tax reform is happening, it's been bad for 30 years since the 86 Act. What is tipping it into the point now that they're willing to act? It is the inversions. It is all these companies that have been leaving to go overseas, and all these foreign companies who are acquiring U.S. companies that Congress finally said, this is crazy. We're losing jobs, we're losing capital, people are leaving, and no CEO wakes up in the morning and says, what a great day this is, I'm going to move my company to outside the United States. It is the last decision any CEO wants to make. Why are they doing it? It's because it's like the frog in the boiling water. It's gotten turned up so hot they better jump out right now. And so that's what's driving tax reform. So what's the answer to your point? What are they going to have to do? I think actually the president did it right this time, and we can argue about health care. President is not going to write a bill that Congress is going to pass. President's got to lay out what his policies are, what's most important to him, what's his priorities. And I think you see it in his statement, his priorities and his policies. It is about lowering the corporate rate and the pass-through rate and moving to a competitive international system, which in this case is territorial. Is there any chance it's going to look like what he proposed in the end? No. These are principles that he's saying. Low as we can get, he says 15%. Now the politics kicks in. So what's going to happen? Everyone's going to come out screaming. The state and local guys are going to come out and saying, you're taking away my state and local tax deduction. Real estate guys taking away my interest deduction. You know, the R&D folks that are taking away my... And so everything is going to see how many votes are we going to lose if we keep these things out. And you know what? Some things are going to have to be put back in. So now the rate goes from 15% to 17% to 19%. So you'll get to a more reasonable rate. But that's what's happening. The president, I mean, some are saying the president proposed this huge $5 trillion debt increase. He really didn't. He's just not outlining all the other things that have to be in there that Congress has to work through. I don't think he knows. I mean, they're not stupid. They know they cannot pass something that has a huge debt increase because it will require 60 votes in the Senate. So bottom line is, I think you're going to see this process work through, and it's going to be, what's going to happen, you're going to have lower corporate rates. You're going to have pass-through rates that are going to be much closer to the top individual rate, because you're absolutely right. You can play a whole lot of games if you have a very low pass-through rate and a high individual tax rate. You can't stay there. And you're going to see some of these deductions and credits and incentives who have been in the code for a long time go, or you're not going to have tax reform this year.
Yeah. So I want to just agree with Mark. I don't think that was a plan. I mean, that was an opening bid that said, here's some important things. The most important thing about that piece of paper, maybe you haven't plowed all the way through it yet, but
it takes a long time to get through.
Is that it did not rule out one thing that is under active consideration on the Hill. So it did not in any way set back the process that's going on in the House and the Senate toward getting to a bottom line. He just shaped where in that are the markers that matter to the White House.
You don't think by not including border adjustability that it ruled that out?
No.
Okay.
In fact,
expensing wasn't in there explicitly.
That's true.
None of the key provisions. They just.
I think what
pass.
you said, though, what you heard is the president, what he doesn't care about. Well, right now, what he wants, he laid out what he wants, and he's saying, for me, border adjustability is not important. I don't want it. I may not say you can't have it. He laid out a lot of things that aren't as important to him. What he didn't mention are things that are not as important.
Right. Yeah. Chris, I want to bring you in on the pass-through question, because it is a big one if you're going to lower the pass-through to 15 as well, and open up this opportunity for arbitraging the system and getting a lot of hedge fund managers and people who might be in the room to pay a nice low tax rate. And Secretary Mnuchin says there'll be a mechanism to ensure that doesn't happen. I think Gary has said it, and others in the administration have said it, but no specifics on how you do that. Do you have any insight into how Senate Finance might address that, or Congress more broadly might approach the problem of applying a 15% or whatever rate we end up at, 20, 21, 22, to both corporations and pass-throughs in a way that doesn't become an abusive tax arbitrage?
Yeah, first of all, Gene, we miss you so much. Let me address a couple things that Gene said real quickly, though. There's the thought of Congress passing a move toward territorial system without addressing base erosion is it's fallacy. That's going to happen, and to try to find. And I think it's also very fair to say, look, we've been working very closely with the Secretary and Gary and the President on their proposals for months now. This clearly is an opening bid for the president to begin a conversation with the American people and the fine people here in the audience and around the country and around the world about how best to engage in a process that's going to get us and yield us a bill that hopefully will be lasting and change our system and our economy to a way that's actually going to grow again. On the pass-through rates, again. While I can't go through the details, and we're actively negotiating now, but it's impossible to think that we're going to not put guardrails and significant constraints on what defines small business activity and what defines a small business. Mm-hmm. So the reality is of having some sports star becoming a pass-through to take advantage of the 15% rate or whatever rate we achieve. It's just really unrealistic. It's, as I think Doug said, that hopefully we're not all stupid on Capitol Hill. We've been at this for a long time, and I think we know there's a political reality. There's also an economic reality when addressing tax reform. And the economic reality is that we have to find a way to fund the government, the things that we as Americans need for government, but do so in a way that's actually fair. So let's broaden the base, let's lower the rates as best we can, make the system more fair, and for the vast majority of Americans who are non-itemizers and that just take advantage of the code in a way that and pay their taxes and work hard, let's make it so that they can let's change their interaction with the IRS, and it's change the way let's simplify the code in a way that actually is going to make it easier for them.
Chris can't say this, but I can on stage. Tax reform might begin in the House, but it goes through and ends in the Senate Finance Committee. Anybody knows how Washington operates in tax reform, that's where it's
No,
always
please,
happened.
please, no, don't let it end there.
It ends on the president's desk when the president signs
Okay,
it.
There is that
right.
step
Valid
in the
point.
process.
I
but
self-corrected.
but in,
Thank
in
you.
terms of the actual language of the legislation.
Correct. The language of the legislation. So what comes out of the House, the Senate will review and decide if there are any elements of that package that they want to accept, and they'll put one or two of those in there, and then they'll
And
have
they'll
their
write
own
it.
plan.
Right.
Right.
So can I just, this isn't actually disagreeing with something Chris said, but just clarifying. I think that the concerns on the pass-through rate is, and I think you actually said this right, but I just want to clarify it. It's not just the guardrails against somebody who's getting wage income now. So I actually used probably a bad example because it's playoff season.
Right. Basketball on the brain, I understand.
I think a lot of the controversy is more about what is existing now. If you actually just count all pass-through, then let's just be honest, every corporate law firm, it's not that every corporate law firm is a small business, every corporate law partner is a small business. I doubt that plays very well with people. And I think it has been a struggle I think it's been a struggle for years for people to try to figure out how they give parity to people they want to. Now, there was efforts to talk about having your own version of retained earnings and things, so I'm not saying there's been no work done on this, but I think what is going to draw a lot of opposition, I think not just from progressives, but I think from probably some Republican voters as well, if they understand the details, is not just the slippage, which is more of a scoring issue that more people come in, but the very definitional issues. And I think that's where a lot of work is going to be done. And, look, Chris Campbell, I'll say this is one of the guys on Capitol Hill who takes things seriously and works through practical problems. But there's a lot of pressure from a lot of people who are just looking out for their particular interest or have a very kind of simplistic or ideological view, and they can put a lot of constraints even when you control both parties and even when you're doing reconciliation.
Go ahead, Doug.
So I think it's important. I mean, these pass-through issues are going to be a big design issue, but I think it's important to step back and think about the character of what's being proposed. This is actually nothing like 1986. 1986 was, let's have the business community pay more in taxes to cut things on the personal side. That was the basic structure of that deal. This is all about improving the business climate, right? The president is in the White House because the economy is performing poorly and people send him there to make it perform better. The House and the Senate are Republican majorities for exactly the same reason. And they are focusing the tax reform on those business entities, C Corps and pass-throughs, in an effort to improve the climate for wage growth, productivity growth, and ultimately better economic performance. That's what it's all about that. And so the focus on these business entities is appropriate. This is a tax reform debate that has very little discussion about the individual side to date. It's really quite remarkable. But I think that's appropriate. This is where we have the problems. The headquarters are walking offshore, and the capex in the domestic environments economy is not very good, and wage and productivity growth have been poor, and they're trying to solve those problems.
Yeah.
But I do want to stress that, and look, I agree that we have to look for our competitiveness, and look, I think if you had in her own way, if you had Hillary Clinton administration, she would be asking how you affect the tax code to make investment more sticky here, encourage people to locate here. So, I mean, I think that's appropriate. But I think one place maybe people disagree with this, but I do think our effective tax rate, we're the most attractive market in the world. We're not Europe where people just move across to a country easily. There was a very serious investor who said in one of the private meetings, so I won't quote him by name, that, we're the premium country, So we could be at keep the effective tax rate the same. And you can argue about the structural things, but it is the structural issues of how we do worldwide repatriation, et cetera, that affect location. So true reform does not need to give away $2 to $3 trillion or raise the debt or put pressure on cutting Medicare or whatever. It does not need to do that. So you really, I think, do have to separate the reform you might want to need to encourage investment in the U.S., and then you have to ask separately, do you actually have to raise that much less for the public fisc to do that? And I don't think there is a strong argument that you need to have such a large net tax cut if you had the right type of reform, whether it was a more progressive version or a more conservative version of that reform.
Okay, I want to go to Mark on this and then maybe back to Chris on it as well. And it's to do with border adjustability. And the White House line now is, we don't think it works in its current form. I don't know what that means. I don't know what another form of it would be or how they would change it to make it acceptable. And I don't think they do either. But what is your view, Mark, on the idea of doing a border adjustable tax to generate this $1 trillion in revenue over 10 years? I know the Senate's not real keen on it, and it doesn't have a great future there. But is it this terrible thing, or is it just retailers and others who don't like it lobbying against it? Talk us through it.
Well, yeah, it's first of all, it's not just a border adjustable piece. It's moving to a whole new cash flow tax system that makes it border adjustable.
Right.
Correct.
So it's taking away the entire income tax system in the United States of America and moving to a cash flow system.
Right.
And then saying we're going to border adjust the tax, okay? That, if you had 5 years, maybe you could honestly figure out how to execute that and understand the price changes and understand and phase it in enough time, all those things. Problem is, we got about 6 months left this year. If they want to get it done this year, I think what they're saying is that's a bridge too far in the 6-month period that we have. That is first of all, in so many ways, it is a theoretically very attractive plan because it taxes consumption and not savings. It moves towards like the value-added tax systems other countries have. The difference is it's not an additional value-added tax added to goods and services.
Right.
It is the whole new tax system. And nowhere in the world have they figured out how to tax financial services, as an example, under a value-added tax. So they would be really experimenting with 100% of the tax base, not an additional tax base. When value-added taxes were added in other countries, they replaced cascading sales taxes. They didn't replace the entire income tax. So it is a really bold experiment. I give the House credit for that. But I think that what you're hearing is we're not going to be able to get that done this year. There's too much uncertainty. There's a real concern from the retailers. Prices will not adjust on time, and prices will go up before the benefit of the lower taxes are there. Whether that's true or not, you're going to have the economists argue against the business people. The economists all say it's going to adjust, no problem. The business people say, no way, it's going to kill us. So you're not going to have an answer, and probably we wouldn't know until we tried it.
Right.
And I think what you're hearing is that if you're going to do this at all, it's going to be much smaller, it's going to be delayed, it's going to be exceptions in it, and it may be used to some sort of border tax of some sort could be used to try and raise some money. But I think they're going to look for every other way they can before they get to that.
You want to get it on the bat?
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I think it's there's a set of threshold questions here. One is, how did the House end up with what Mark has correctly described as the single most dramatic proposed change to business taxation ever? This combination of going to a cash flow and the border adjustment and all that. And the answer is, Dave Camp took 2 very serious runs at comprehensive income tax reform that was revenue neutral, went to a territorial system, got the rate down to 25%, got us in the vicinity of the OECD median, and tried to satisfy the distributional constraints. And he never got a vote in his committee.
Doug, but there's one big, you know this, there's a big difference between what Doug Camp had to do and where we are today.
No, I'm just...
Which is the baseline for policy baseline and the growth, which is now you have dynamic scoring, and so there are other things that can get you there closer.
So I agree. They also did dynamically score his, but I'm just saying my understanding from working with the committee, how they ended up here is that gave them an outcome that looked too much like what we had now. Didn't think they'd get the growth impacts they wanted, so they decided to just rip it up and go down another route. And it's a very dramatically different route. There's no question about it. And it hangs together in a very intricate way. And that's a really bad thing politically, because you start pulling away at one thing or another, it doesn't hang together very well. And so the concern that I think everyone raises is, if you want to have permanent tax reform, it's got to be revenue neutral. And if you don't want to go down this cash flow route, you want to stay in income tax, the House guy's concern is, we end up doing the Dave Camp exercise, and that wasn't very satisfying. And so it's a complicated situation right now.
I want to talk about the border adjustment. Most economists would say there'd be almost an instantaneous response in the value of the dollar. I don't think that's true. If that were the only thing you were doing was the border tax, but there's a lot of other moving pieces, right? So is it 5 years? Maybe you get an equilibrium where the exchange rate adjusts, but it won't be instantaneous. And I think in our own profession, I think this is a fallacy because I've heard people state this is a fact, and it's not a fact.
No, there are two different things, and this gets misquoted all the time. Number one is, suppose we had a country that had done us the favor historically of adopting a VAT, and then it would have all sorts of real impacts on the economy, and it would take 5-6 years for it to fully impact the growth trajectory, the productivity, all those things, and the real exchange rate and the current account. That would all play out over time. There's a second thing, which is a year later they decide to border adjust it, and you get a one-time, other things being the same revaluation of the currency. The trouble is, no one's ever done that, and so you never get to see the border piece in isolation. So the statement that the dollar will be, say, 25% higher because of the reform is just wrong.
It is.
No one has any clue.
Chris, I've seen you doing a lot of head nodding over here as we've discussed the future of this cash flow system or a border adjustment. Is it just safe to assume that that has no future in the Senate?
So I would say this, I mean, our members, my boss, our committee members are extremely thrilled about what the House did in their putting out their bold blueprint. The beginning of the conversation, they were the first ones that went on this and gave this incredibly big idea, which has certainly energized the business community and it certainly energized the retailers to educate our members.
Lots of education occurring in D.C. on that one.
About the positives and potential negatives of the border adjustment tax. I think the retailers, just candidly, have done a very good job of educating Republican members in the Senate. While we remain agnostic, and candidly, my boss is, we're still waiting on the JCT numbers and to kind of see where the reality sets in on kind of how it will distribute and who bears the burden, all those kinds of issues. For us right now, I think it's it's incredibly important the Speaker and our sister committee, the Ways and Means Committee, that the BAT be a part of the conversation. We're willing to entertain the concept and try to find a way to make it work. Both the Speaker and the Chairman of Ways and Means suggested that with tweaks, perhaps it can work. And we're open to that conversation, but I will say that the opponents of the border adjustment tax have done a very good job at educating Republican
just
members.
on that point, Chris, as you know, for everyone out here, it's not just the retailers.
No,
It's oil and gas companies, the real estate companies.
I mean,
They're not the only ones lobbying against
a lot of people. So
Can I tell you?
Let me just not let him off the hook on the tweaks question, because I want to just give me an example
you're
of
going to
a
kill me.
tweak.
You're going to get me killed.
Yeah.
This is off the record.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
It'll never be on the
Let's
internet.
get back to
My own
Speaker at all.
edification,
No.
everybody says we don't think it works in its
you
current
speak
form.
up?
I see a tape recorder.
Hey, we're on the record here. I read a column every day. I need content. It's put right in there. Maybe at some point we'll have some insight into what these tweaks might be. To me, it sounds like rhetoric now to say it's ultimately going to be dead, but we're going to keep it alive now rhetorically by saying maybe it works with tweaks, and then eventually it dies. Let's say it dies and you don't have that revenue piece of it at all, and you still want to get to revenue neutrality. What is the alternate pathway there? If we do all that you say that you want to do, which is both the corporate side and the individual side, and get the rate, let's say 20% for sake of argument, and do individual rate cuts as well. If you don't have border adjustment, obviously the White House has talked about getting rid of all deductions except mortgage and charitable. You're going to have big fights over state and local, every deduction you try to get rid of. What are the alternatives for getting that revenue?
So, while I would love to answer all those questions, we never negotiate against ourselves in public, but I will say this, that there's, first of all, I think it really matters if, to Gene's point, if Democrats are willing to come in and sit down in a conversation, it matters of kind of the nature of the package we can put together. Candidly, just to be very candid with you, that there's a reason why the president proposed keeping the deductions that he did. State and local tax distributes on blue states. So candidly, if we're putting together a 51-vote bill in the U.S. Senate, it's actually would be surprisingly easy to pass a package that would completely eliminate state and local tax deduction on Republican votes alone. A little more difficult in the House, but in the Senate, quite surprisingly would be easy. But the nature changes if the Democrats come into the conversation. And so, I think it's important to note that, again, I would see the president's first volley as something, as a beginning of a conversation, and the Secretary and Gary have asked for and are encouraging Democrats to play in the process. It'll be lasting that way, and that's kind of the way that we would approach the conversation as well. But it's going to be a process of rate reduction, but also trying to identify what can go in the code, state and local and other issues, but also taking a different approach to the big ideas that the House has put together: the border adjustment tax, interest, all those other issues, and they all have rate targets. They all have numbers that JCT will assign to us, and again, I can't go into specifics, but I will say that have been working assiduously for months now to try to find ways to, if the border adjustment tax fund somehow falls out, how best to supplant that with something that would not be a la Dave Camp, that would not be Camp-esque, but would be a kind of if you will, a half measure that would provide for the revenue lost by the border adjustment tax, but also would not be a simple elimination of deductions that comes.
Here's an idea to throw out. Now, I know you can't reveal anything, Chris, but
Well, he can, he just won't.
well,
there is a
difference.
I can, but I lose my
technically.
job.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
I don't care.
what if you
We wanna have a really good panel.
What if you raise the income cap on Social Security tax, right? What if you? So that would be, progressive. If you increase the cap, it would bring in, I don't know how, I haven't calculated how much it might bring in, but it seems to me that might be a good compromise mechanism on the personal income tax side, right? You might pay for a little bit.
It's an incredibly great idea. The challenge is there's only one thing you cannot touch in reconciliation: it's Social Security. That's
that's
fatal,
true.
and so you cannot touch, even ancillarily, you can't touch Social
I'm an
Security.
economist.
I
I'm
know.
not
Those crazy
Thinking
rules that you're
theory, not
setting.
in political reality.
But we have, it's just the constraints in reconciliation are very vast. But one of the biggest things that we cannot do in any way touch, even kind of ancillarily, is Social Security taxes. So it really limits what we can and can't do in tax reform.
I think the reason, Chris has a very tough job right now. He really does, because the border adjustment, first of all, people may know, of course, the border adjustment tax was initially proposed by a Democrat economist in a paper for the Center for American Progress. I think any of us on this panel find it intellectually very interesting. It's a new idea. It's interesting to wrestle with. But I think it's ultimately doomed for a couple of reasons. One is it's not easy to tweak.
Yeah.
You really have to have a cash flow. So you really have to do the eliminating interest deductibility while getting expensing. Now, it may be that the previous administration and Congress have made that harder because the bonus depreciation has now made the benefit of full expensing less attractive compared to the loss of interest deductibility. And tweaking like the phase-in, probably economists would say, does not keep the dollar from adjusting, so it could actually lead to worst of all worlds. But I think ultimately it's going to be politics in the following sense, and I will say this having talked to people on the other side of the aisle, which is they've dreamed about doing tax reform. Now there's going to be a tax reform where their opponent will be able to say that that is a 20% tax increase. And when they say to their Democratic opponent, oh, you're just being a Democratic partisan, he says, I give the rest of my time to the following ad from the Koch brothers, and from Walmart, and from, so once these ads have been laid out there, you have to really believe in this deeply. I think Paul Ryan and Kevin Brady really believe in this deeply. The number of people who really believe in this deeply don't go that far beyond the two of them.
Right, yeah. No, that seems to
Gene,
be
we
right.
found something to agree on.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Doug, about the idea of the infrastructure piece of this and the lack of it in either the blueprint or in Secretary Mnuchin's comments today and others in the administration who've basically just dropped the idea that we could do, I don't know whether it's from the deemed repatriation or how they structure it to have a piece of it that's infrastructure based to bring along Democratic votes. As we have this conversation and hear from Chris, I think more, is that just an opening bid, and then as it moves along, they'll say, okay, we're going to sweeten this and get some Democratic support so they can do it in a way that's not reconciliation. I mean, what do you see as the future for including infrastructure spending as part of a tax reform package? Or should we just assume that that's not happening?
So I don't think you should rule it out. It was, I'd say about 2 weeks ago that I heard Chairman Brady say something to the effect of, there could be a piece for infrastructure in this. That was 180 degrees from where the House had been historically. They had always said the money from tax reform is going to be used for tax reform, and that is that. We're just trying to circle around this thing. So that was a big change, and I thought indicative of interest in the different parties in doing that. I would say that, as is true for this administration in general, like they have many, many priorities which they haven't sort of laid out what's bigger, what's smaller, and everything. Infrastructure's just floated along.
Right.
And so we don't genuinely know what it is that constitutes an infrastructure proposal that the president would support. What's the boundary around infrastructure? What counts, what doesn't count? What's the federal role in this versus state locality? All that stuff. And I think that's what's missing, because if you're going to take a chunk of the money out of tax reform and you're going to give up a lower rate here, or you're going to give up the capacity to do less base broadening, you want to know what you're getting for it. Yeah. And I think that's the problem right now. Infrastructure sounds good, but Republicans, it's been a big effort, especially in the House, to have the Republicans not be instantly dismissive of this, to be receptive at all.
Right. Yeah.
And
but
so
it's not the failed Obama stimulus.
Well, it can't be stimulus, it can't be shovel-ready projects, it can't be any of those things. And they quite frankly thought they, quote, did this when they passed the Surface Transportation Bill. Right. And so they're like, well, we just did this, we're not doing it again.
Right.
So there's a lot of education and sales that needs to be done on the infrastructure piece per se before it's going to be easily ported into a tax bill.
Right. And to me, the other question is, and actually I proposed this 7 years ago in a study called Jobs for America. We linked together infrastructure investment with changes in business taxes. The question to me is, will you get a single Democratic vote by going through that process and looking at repatriation on a one-time basis to go into infrastructure? Would it get you a single Democratic vote in the Senate? Gene, would it get us a single vote?
It goes back to what I said. Listen, there's not an effort. I'm not saying that Chairman Hatch and others wouldn't have liked to engage in an effort. But look, the proposal going forward is just a classically very conservative proposal. It lowers taxes for the most well-off Americans. It lowers taxes to 15%. It talks about deficit spending, not for infrastructure, something Democrats would support, but for a large corporate tax cut. So now, you can say that's Republicans' right. They won the election. They have all three branches of government. People compromise when they have to. It might be wise for them to compromise. It might be better for them in the long run. But right now, President Trump has not put forward anything that would allow almost any Democrat to come forward. Now, if you change the individual side of the tax cut to be basically a middle-class tax cut, and if you took all the one-time deemed repatriation for infrastructure, remember, Secretary Mnuchin said at one point there'll be no net tax cut for the top 1%. Right. That's not looking so good right now. This is a very, very, this is going to be an enormous tax cut for very well-off Americans, and it's symbolically for people, the president himself and the cabinet. This is not an invitation. Now, it may be that in the Senate, Chairman Hatch and others will give that invitation, but right now, the hand has not been reached out, and you can say that's not wise of Republicans, or you can say that's their right. They won all three branches of government, and often when people win all three branches, they try to get their vision through, as opposed to compromise. So they would have to change very significantly on the distribution of the individual tax cut, how the deficit financing for the individual tax cut, and having a robust a more classic infrastructure plan. I don't think that is an impossible thing. I think in divided government, people might have tried to work toward that. I don't see that happening right now from the President of the United States or the House of Representatives.
Right, but Chris, I mean, to get back to your political points about the necessity of doing individual and corporate at the same time, and not having, you know, a president who won a lot of blue collar, you know, some Democratic voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I mean, really owes his electoral college victory to those people who you might not think would be super excited about doing a supply side tax cut for corporations and potentially for wealthy Americans, and who don't like the fact that their roads and their bridges are crappy and would like to see new stuff get built and better trains and all that kind of stuff. Like, and that's all in Trump's wheelhouse. You know, he likes that kind of stuff. So why isn't there, or maybe there could be, this path towards a more bipartisan approach to this that includes an infrastructure piece, funded however you decide to fund it? But wouldn't the politics ultimately be better for him, and perhaps for congressional Republicans as well, to do that rather than slam through with 51 votes a big corporate rate cut?
So I would suggest that the plan the president outlined does not take off the table anything that Gene just laid out.
Right.
Absolutely, literally nothing that Gene laid out could theoretically could fit into his proposal. There are some things that Democrats don't like. I mean, some of the child care pieces that have been important to the president. Doug outlined that a lot of congressional Republicans have a challenge with the infrastructure package because of what President Obama did when he first came into office with the stimulus package. But we're open, right? So congressional Republicans have unified against either of those two proposals. There's several things I think that would invite a bipartisan conversation. You will see from my perspective, from our committee perspective, a bipartisan process underway in the next couple of next couple of weeks. And so I think that it's important for us to engage Democrats in this conversation. It's important for them, I believe, to engage themselves and involve themselves, so that the bill can better reflect some of their values as well. And so again, I don't think that there's anything, Gene, I mean, to just suggest that there's nothing that's in the president's plan. I think, look, if you look at it from a cynical, ideological purity perspective from the Democratic side, yeah, because I mean, there's tax cuts and there are other things, but there's a lot not said. The president has, and I will say this on specifically on tax reform, this president is uniquely non-ideological.
Yes.
We talked to him many, many times, his economic team many, many times. They are surprisingly and amazingly non-ideological. The president wants a plan. The president wants something that's big and bold for the economy, and he wants economic growth. That's what he wants. I think that every American wants the same thing, and I believe that that well-meaning, well-intentioned Republicans and Democrats can get there. And so I think, I urge Democratic senators all day, every day, as well as House members when I speak to them, to look at the president's proposal as something that's a beginning of a conversation.
And also keep in mind that several of the president's top economic advisors were registered Democrats.
Yes, they were. Yeah. We've got like 4 minutes left, so I want to give each panelist literally 1 minute, Gene, to give us your prognostication for what is actually going to happen the rest of this year. What's going to pass, and when is it going to be active? When is it going to start impacting the economy? So just, like 30 seconds to a minute. We'll just start with you.
I think something will get through because it has to. I've been working on this for too many years. I don't have that many years left. Because I don't know if we'll ever get this alignment again when you have Republicans controlling the White House and both sides of Congress. So,
okay, so something, and what will it be?
I think we'll get business tax reform, and I would include in that some modification to the personal tax system on the pass-throughs, but a lot of the rate cuts and the higher rates may have to go by the wayside.
Yeah.
That's my own feeling, because it's got to get done now, and I think business will push very hard to get it done, and it's going to happen, but it's going to be very messy.
Okay, Doug.
That's a bold statement, huh?
If something gets through, it'll have to be permanent, so it'll have to be revenue neutral.
It will.
It will have to genuinely support better economic growth, and that's going to be the litmus test for everybody involved. I'd say the going in odds in that right now are below 50-50. There's a lot of work to be done on that, particularly White House leadership to get it over the finish line. So, but I think it's either that or bust, quite frankly. And I don't see just a pure unpaid for rate cut in the future.
Being possible. Okay, Gene, you have any prediction for us?
I think that if they do get rid of the state and local deduction, Chris will have to remember there's a lot of Republican members of the House in New York and California, and they're actually up in 2018.
And New Jersey.
I would, right now, it's hard to believe that they would allow failure to be a complete option.
Yeah.
I do not see them converging right now. I see people still dug in on border adjustment and others, so I think it's a while to go. I think, and I'm not really seeing the path to a permanent, so I would not be surprised if they do get something passed that it will sunset at the end of the budget window.
Okay. Mark, final word.
Yeah, there will be no Democrats who will support what the Republicans come up with. So all the fantasy about everything on the table, I think it's not. I think is not everything on the table. I think it'll be a rate cut offset by deductions and credits taken away. I don't think it'll be permanent because I think it will somehow. I don't think anything is permanent. I mean, 4 years. If you had a permanent 4 years from now, if you have a Democratic president, it could all go away anyway. So I don't think at the end of the day, permanence will be the biggest thing they fight for. I think it'll be stimulus. Short-term deficits will go up, and longer term, they're going to try and offset it with growth, the policy budget, and with curtailing the rate cuts so they'll be more reasonable and not down to 15%.
Right. Okay. We're out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion.
Very good.